Hi everyone. So I hope you enjoyed the video, the episode from The Story of Ireland. It's a really excellent series that actually, and we use it quite a lot in this course just to kind of underpin what we're learning. But the takeaway from that is that what we see after the defeat of James II at the Battle of the Boyne in 1690 is an Ireland that, yes, has religious divisions, but is growing in wealth, in prosperity, and for the more privileged members of this Protestant ascendancy that was described in the video, or the Irish ascendancy, life was pretty good by the 18th century. And for a tiny minority of Catholics who had either held onto their land or had managed to kind of crawl their way up the social ladder, there were opportunities, particularly if, like William Connolly, you were prepared to renounce your faith for the sake of your own, furthering your own position in Ireland. So I hope you enjoyed that video. It's very informative and it gives you a sense, I think, of what Ireland was like by the 1700s. And of course, our course starts in 1791. So looking at today's title slide, that's what I want to talk to you about. You'll be pleased to know that because you've already watched your video and answered the questions, I'm going to keep this quite short. So I just want to explain a few things that didn't come up with the video. So it's a pretty old-fashioned lesson on here today. You need your pen and paper. Hopefully you've already written the title for today's lesson. So you're just going to make some notes based on the slides. I'm going to talk to you and you can just kind of make some notes, and that will do. So what we're aiming to do today is look at what Ireland was like by 1791. So underpinning all of these few kind of starter lessons is the question of Anglo-Irish relations in the 18th century, which of course is the 1700s. So what was the relationship like between Britain and Ireland? Video touched on that. I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about the Irish Parliament and what they could and couldn't do. So success criteria. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to describe at least 3 ways in which Catholics were discriminated against. We've got a big long list, so that's easy. I can explain how the Protestant ascendancy maintained their privileged position, and I can judge which area of life Catholics suffered the most in. And the stretch and challenge for those of you that want to think deeply is we're going to look at some of the economic problems that Catholics in Ireland had, but how did the political system kind of make that situation worse in a way? So it's just something to think about as we go through. Right, let's get started. First slide. So how was Ireland punished for supporting a Catholic king? So we know that James II was defeated after his humiliating retreat at the Battle of the Boyne. So that spelled the end of Irish Catholic hopes that they would have a sympathetic king. And as a result of the Irish Catholics supporting King James II, they were punished by a series of penal laws. So you might want to write maybe 3 or 4 of these down as examples. They couldn't attend Parliament. They couldn't be members of Parliament either. They couldn't even vote. They couldn't have any public office. So they couldn't be civil servants. They couldn't work for the government. They couldn't be lawyers. They couldn't be mayors. They couldn't work as officers in the army. They could be cannon fodder. They couldn't carry a weapon or a horse worth over £5. So straight away there, you've got a form of social control. They couldn't have anything that was of value, in other words. No Catholic schools, another form of social control. Because without education, they couldn't access opportunities for good jobs or, become prosperous. No Catholic bishops. So they could have Catholic churches, that was fine. They were allowed to obviously practice their religion, but there was to be no hierarchy within that religion, only priests allowed, which again kept it at a lower level than the equivalent Protestant religion in Ireland. Catholic-owned land had to be split between all heirs upon the death of the owner. Now, this was a clever one. So it meant that over time, any large estates of Catholic land just disappeared, ceased to exist, because Catholic families tended to be larger, and therefore every male in the family had to have an equal portion of the land available. In Protestant families, the law of primogeniture carried on, which meant that the entire massive estate was inherited by the eldest male child. So their status and wealth that was often drawn from land continued, and over time the Irish status and wealth connected to land dwindled. And new Catholic churches were to be built out of wood, not stone, because of course that limited the style of the building, it limited the length of time that it would stay there, and they were not to be built on a main road. They weren't to be visible, in other words. So these kind of series of kind of, you know, rather petty laws ensured that Catholics in Ireland had a second-class status as they moved into the next century, into the 18th century. So you can pause this and maybe write, I said maybe write 4 down, maybe write 5 down, examples of the penal laws, things that were keeping Catholics in their places. It's helpful if you choose, don't just choose the first 4, choose the ones that you think would have had the biggest impact on the social status of Catholics. Okay, so pause me, I'm going on to the next slide, I will see you there. Okay, so the political situation, oh apologies, I haven't changed that title. The old course was 1798, so sometimes little typos like the one at the top of that slide slip in. So political situation by 1791, that should say, and it's the same, don't worry, it doesn't change in those 7 years. So we've got there a painting representing the Grattan Parliament in Dublin. Ireland had had a parliament of sorts for centuries. And there was a big change in 1782 as a result of the campaigning of Henry Grattan. Henry Grattan was an Irish Protestant, because of course Catholics couldn't sit in Parliament, but he was nevertheless very fed up, concerned with the way that the English parliamentary system dominated Irish affairs. So before 1782, the constitution in Ireland meant that anything they wanted to pass had to go back to the English Parliament. The English Parliament could change it, rewrite it, do what they liked with it, and then send it back to Ireland, at which point the Parliament in Ireland had 2 options: accept it, reject it. They couldn't amend the laws themselves, they had no say over it. So really, they had very little actual legislative power. And Henry Grattan and his followers, known as the Patriots, campaigned, and in 1782 they were successful in changing the Irish constitution. And so from 1782, the Irish Parliament, the Grattan Parliament, there we go, we'll go on to there, had much more power. It still was restricted by London, by the English Parliament, but less than it had been before. So let's have a look at the information on the slide. So Ireland had possessed a parliament of sorts for centuries, but it had little power. It had only the limited ability to approve or reject laws proposed by Britain. A new constitution removed that restriction, meant that the Irish Parliament had much more freedom. So they could propose laws, they could put them through to Westminster, they could come back, they could amend them themselves. So they had much more power over what was passed in Ireland. The remaining problem, as the next line says, is that Westminster still had the final power of veto over any laws that they really, really didn't like. So Ireland didn't have total freedom, but it was better than it had been. And there we go, we've got a picture of Henry Grattan down the bottom there. So if you want to just jot a few of those things down, pause me, and I'll see you at the next slide. Okay, so we've thought about the political system. Let's think about religious discrimination. So we've said already that only Protestants could be MPs in the Grattan Parliament. Catholics could not be MPs, and they could vote, actually. We'll talk about that in a second. They did gain the vote around this time, but the vote, if you think back to your Pitt Peel course, this is where the 2 courses become really handy because they kind of run parallel to each other. Catholics could only vote if they owned a certain amount of land. There was a £10 property qualification, just as there was in England, and of course the likelihood of a Catholic owning that type of land because of the penal laws was rare. Some did, and they voted, but overall it was much more likely that the electorate would be Protestants. So, and dissenters like Presbyterians. Now, Presbyterians came up at the end of the video. They are Protestants, but they are not Church of Ireland Protestants. So Church of England, Church of Ireland, we sometimes describe that denomination of Protestants as Anglicans. In other words, it's the official state religion of Britain, still is today. although we don't discriminate in quite the same way. So Presbyterians, who were largely concentrated in Ulster, were Protestants, but they were not of the official state religion, so they also were discriminated against. They also were banned from sitting in the Irish Parliament. So here we go. We'll go on to looking at the Act which gave the chance for Catholics to vote. So the two in black at the top are the two that fall outside the time frame of your course. So nice to know for context, you wouldn't be asked about it in an exam. The ones in red are the ones that do fall within the time frame of your course. So you really need to know those. So, but it's nice to kind of get the context. So this is a kind of brief little timeline. So in 1778, Catholics who swore loyalty to the British monarch were finally allowed to inherit and purchase their own land in Ireland. In 1782, we have the Constitution of Ireland, which created the Grattan Parliament with a little bit more freedom for legislative independence. Legislative means to make laws. In 1791, different denominations of religion were now allowed to practice their faith, and of course that largely included Catholics. They could now take up higher positions within the legal profession. So the example for this is Daniel O'Connell, mentioned in the video there, and he's massive in our course, so you'll get to know him very well. So he was one of the first barristers, Catholic barristers in Ireland, and they were now allowed to open schools. They had to pay for them and run them themselves, but at least they could have some kind of education. 2 years later, the Catholic Relief Act allowed Catholics to take degrees, although it was non-matriculated study. They didn't actually get a certificate of graduation. And they were finally allowed to vote, but they had to obviously meet the property qualifications, as I've explained. And finally, 1829, Catholic emancipation is finally granted in Ireland, and this is a huge theme for our course, so we will come back to this in a lot more detail. But equal civil and political rights for Catholics in Ireland were finally granted, including the right to become MPs, and almost all positions in Ireland were now available to Catholics as well as Protestants. Okay, so if you want to jot that down, pause and get what you want from that slide. Okay, so getting towards the end now, we're nearly there, guys. So just thinking ahead to next lesson when we'll start focusing on, you know, Ireland's first big rebellion in our time period, which is the 1798 rebellion. We did touch upon that for Pitt's Appeal, of course. We've got there Theobald Wolfe Tone. So to the left-hand side, and his very kind of distinctive nose, I always think, on his profile. Very, very Roman nose. So many Irishmen resented Westminster's control. And Thomas Paine's Rights of Man and the French Revolution, of course, inspired many Irish. So it didn't just inspire English radicals, it inspired Irish radicals to, you know, consider that it was right and proper that they should fight for independence and, you know, throw off the tyranny of their rulers. The French had done that, why couldn't the Irish? And Wolfe Tone was particularly inspired by this. He was a Protestant, he was a Protestant lawyer actually, well-educated man. And in 1791, he didn't actually, technically, he didn't set up the United Irishmen. They already existed, but he kind of took over and rebranded them. So we'll set up, will do. And they were a group, they were not a religious group, but they were a group of Irishmen that wanted Irish independence. And in practice, a lot of the people in it were Presbyterians because, of course, they were Protestants, but they had an axe to grind. They had been discriminated against within the Irish system. And in 1795, the Society of United Irishmen, I often refer to them as the SUI in my notes because otherwise you have to write out that long title a lot. So they joined with the Defenders. Worth getting that down as well. You need to know about the Defenders, who are a secretive organisation largely made up of Catholics. So what you've got now is an alliance between rural Catholics and kind of more urban, if you like, from towns and cities, Presbyterians. And the Presbyterians, of course, have a little bit more social status, a little bit more wealth, a little bit more clout. So now it's starting to look quite dangerous, this group. Okay, do pause because I'm moving on. So if you need to get that down, pause. So economic status. We know that in Ireland, in the province of Ulster, which you'll know from your map that you drew last time is the northern of the four provinces, industrialisation was taking place a reasonable pace, particularly Belfast. Textiles, just the same as in England, was kind of pushing all of this, and shipbuilding, because the port of Belfast in the city there has got a natural deep water harbour. So it was particularly a good place for building big ships. Other harbours which were shallower, you couldn't carry that out. So geography helped the development of shipbuilding in Belfast. And of course, the history buffs amongst you will know that the Titanic was built in Belfast, of course. Protestants owned linen and shipbuilding factories. There we go. Protestant employers gave the best jobs and housing to Protestant workers. So we've still got discrimination against Catholics, even in urban areas. In the south of Ireland, the other three provinces, so that's Munster, Connaught and Leinster, were still rural. 75% of men were employed in agriculture, so that was the biggest industry. Most of those communities were just tiny little farming communities. They lived in crofts, so often kind of one-room cottages, very poor. 90% of Ireland's land was owned by just 150,000 rich Protestants. So something like 5% of the population owned 90% of the land. So do make sure you've got that statistic down. That's crucial. And as it said on the video, most Catholics rented land. They didn't own it, which meant they were tenants. So the Protestant landowner rented out small portions of his huge estate to Catholics. So we have got a religious economic division, which again will be a source of dissatisfaction and discontent. So if you need to get anything down there, please pause. Okay, final slide. So economic tension across Ireland, population growth then started to put pressure on land and jobs. So in the north we get riots between the privileged Protestants and Catholics who are desperate to improve their status. And in the south, Protestant landlords kind of raise the rent whenever they feel like it. If the Catholic tenants can't pay, their family is evicted from the land. And the tenant land was subdivided between Catholic inheritors. So as the population grew, the plots of land that Catholics were expected to survive on got smaller and smaller and smaller. And because of this, they started to rely on a potato as their main crop, because you can feed a lot of people in a small area of lands. In other areas of the UK, the staple crop was wheat. But you need a big field of wheat to feed a family for a year. And Irish Catholics didn't have big fields. So they moved over and instead started to grow potatoes. And we all know the end result of that by 1845. However, by 1791, it had led to low prices for agricultural produce, more poverty, more bitterness, and so on. A cycle of despair. So just to remind ourselves of what we were trying to achieve, I can describe at least 3 ways in which Catholics were discriminated. I can explain how the Protestant ascendancy maintained their privileged position because of the penal laws and because of the fact, things like inheritance laws, their access to education, the fact that Catholics couldn't do certain jobs. I mean, there's so many things you can say about that. And then which area of life did Catholics suffer the most in? So I want you to just cast your mind back to the notes you've made today and think, was it religious discrimination? Is it economic discrimination? Or is it to do with politics? And your decision there, so religion, the economy or politics, feeds into that stretch and challenge question. The political system. I mean, there was great hoo-ha and fanfare when Grattan succeeded in securing the new Constitution of Ireland in 1782. But did that really help Catholics? Were things improving at all? Maybe they were. They had the vote, but were they in a position to change the situation in Ireland for the better and to improve their lot? Because without access to politics, it's very, very difficult to make those changes without resorting to direct action, and we know what happens there. So lots of kind of things, themes and things to think about as we chart our way through the next few lessons. Right, I'm going to sign off there, guys. Hope you enjoyed that. Short and sweet today, but you should have a really good set of notes now on Ascendancy Ireland, have an understanding of the Protestant ascendancy, land holding at this time, some idea about kind of politics and the religious division between Catholics and Protestants. So I would say that's a pretty good day's work. Okay, and I will be back next week. Cheerio.